So you want to know how to sell your apartment for top dollar fast? The first thing that you want to do is create competition. So let me walk you through the best thing that you need to do in order to gain the top dollar for your apartment complex. The first thing that we look at is creating a pricing strategy. And with the pricing strategy, what you actually are trying to do is try to create an auction-like atmosphere. I talk to a lot of sellers that say, hey, I'm interested in selling my apartment complex, but I don't really want it out on the open market. Either their property manager doesn't know, or they don't want their tenants to know that they're thinking about selling the property. So what I do for my clients is I will go out and quietly shop that property and tell my buyer pool that this property is available. I won't necessarily give them any specifics as far as street address. I may just give them some of the basics, like the year that it was built, the number of units, the general location, if it's professionally managed, if it's a value add opportunity. And what I'm trying to do basically is pre-shop that opportunity before I take it to the open market. Why am I doing that? Because I want to create maximum exposure for your property. So when you get ready to sell your property, you're going to want to have a broker that not only has a plan of action in place, but has a pretty wide net of opportunities and available buyers that are looking for properties like yours. Now, some of the things that go into being ready to put your property on the market is knowing what your property is worth. And a service that I offer to my clients is called a Pinpoint price evaluation. Now, what I do on that is I look at your current rents, the rents that you're in place, that you're receiving right now. And then I also look at the market rents, because one thing that I see with a lot of owners, especially if they've owned the property for a number of years, they may have been slow to raise rents. Well, if your rents are $1,000 for your 2-bedroom, 1-bath units, but market rent is $1,400, we want to look at that and weigh that out. Now, in certain states, Oregon, Washington, different states, there are rent control rules in place, meaning that you're not allowed to raise rents higher than 9.2% currently in Oregon. And that changes on an annual basis, so make sure and check with your local authority on what rent control caps are in place, if there is rent control in your state. But in looking at the market value or applying a cap rate, when I start to do the evaluation in the Pinpoint price evaluation, what I do is I'm looking at your income for in-place rents, and then I compare it to market rents. So let's go back to our scenario where your rents are $1,000 for a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, but market rent is, say, $1,400. I can't just apply $1,400 right across the board for all of the rents and say, well, this owner is selling and he's below market rent, because the new buyer is going to be capped out for how fast and how much they can raise their rents. You can typically only raise rents once a year on an annual basis if you are in a state that has rent control. So when I'm creating a Pinpoint price evaluation, what I want to look at is how are your rents compared to market, and then how are your expenses for the property in comparison to the market expenses. And I typically have a general rule of thumb that I use for maintenance and repair, as well as turnover, insurance, some of those standard expenses that we see across the board. And what I'm trying to do there is come up with a calculation of how is your property being managed and operated compared to what maybe a professional manager would do for a new buyer given a new situation or a scenario. And once I come to the analysis part of the evaluation, what I'm doing again is I'm taking the gross rents, and I'm typically taking out 5% for a vacancy factor, and then I factor in the market expenses. At that point, I'm coming up with a net operating income. And again, as I've mentioned in other videos, the net operating income is like the holy grail. That is the number that a buyer and a seller have to come to an agreement on, that they both agree on the same net operating income number, because at that point we're calculating what either a most probable sales price will be if it's going to be a listing, or what an appraiser, a lender, and a savvy buyer will be using to determine what they're willing to offer you for your property. So determining or agreeing on the net operating income is fairly important. Now, I have situations where sellers say, nope, I won't hear of that. I've never had a 5% vacancy situation. I run 3% or I run 1%. That's okay. If that's how they want to underwrite their file or their transaction or their property, that's their prerogative, because that's their property. So I understand. But there is a situation where we have to look at it through the eyes of a buyer and how a lender and an appraiser is going to look at it, because the last thing that you want to do is put your property on the market, accept an offer, and then most multifamily owners are going to typically do a 1031 tax deferred exchange. The last thing that you want to do is go out and make an offer on a new property, and 30 days down the road you find out, hey, my sale of my relinquishing property or my downleg property, that buyer is terminating because the value isn't there that we agreed upon originally in the purchase and sale contract. In the old days, it used to be, hey, we had a willing and able buyer and we had a willing and able seller, and if they agreed upon a price, then we did everything we could to hit that value. But now it's more mathematically calculated and more of a calculated sales price that we determine. And a lot of that has to do with the cap rate or capitalization rate. And a cap rate or a capitalization rate is basically what the market determines what like and similar properties have sold for based off of a cap rate. And that's what a buyer should be using to apply towards your property and what they're going to be willing to make you an offer. Now, not all cap rates are across the board the same. So as an example, if your property in particular, let's say you have miscellaneous income, you have laundry income, storage income, pet fee income, but all the other properties that we've compared don't have any of that income, but I just boosted or bolstered your income, then we're going to have a problem in the underwriting scenario when the lender and the appraiser for the buyer start to analyze that property. So what I try to do is compare your property across the board with like and similar sold comparable properties, so that I'm really comparing apples to apples. So one of the things that I recommend to people is get a Pinpoint price evaluation from a competent commercial real estate broker. That'll tell you what your property is worth in the current market, utilizing an analysis of your income and expenses, coming up to your net operating income, and then comparing your property to like and similar sold comparables and what other buyers have paid for other like and similar properties. And that'll give you a pretty good idea of what your property would be worth or most probable sales price. Now, we get surprised sometimes if there's pent up demand and there's not a lot of inventory available for sale on the market. We don't see a lot of properties right now on our market, either through our multiple listing service or traditional systems like LoopNet, CoStar, some of the national public sites that are available for buyers and sellers to look at available properties for sale. There's not a lot of those properties available for sale right now. So when I take a property to market, often we will give like a 7-day window to make sure that your property is properly exposed to the market and that everybody has an opportunity to see it. And then we'll call for best and final offer. And what we're trying to do there is tell all the buyers that have been trying to decide whether they were going to make an offer, listen, we're getting ready to make our decision on who we're going to select as the buyer. So put your best foot forward and put your best offer together, because we're about ready to make a decision. Now, some points of interest from the buyer's perspective that we want to look at. Some of the things that they look at is what's the cash flow coming off of that property. I see some investors that use what I call kitchen table economics. Do I have enough cash flow coming in to pay the debt each month? good, I'll buy the property. Now, I typically see that in smaller properties like a duplex, a fourplex, or the smaller properties. When we get to 10 units, 20 units, 40 units, now we're into more of a sophistication where a buyer is actually making a decision based off of the net operating income and the cap rate. But at the end of the day, a buyer's point of interest, the first thing that they want to know is how much income or cash flow will I receive off of this property? So that's the first thing, is cash flow. The second thing that they want to look at is cap rate. What are you asking for your property on a sales price in relation to the cap rate? So as an example, cap rate and sales price are inverse. So if you ask for a 4% cap rate, that's going to push the sales price up. If you ask for a 6 or an 8% cap rate, then that's going to make the sales price lower. And the reason that we see higher cap rates is either the property has deferred maintenance, it's older, it hasn't been rehabbed, maybe it needs some renovation, or it's in maybe a less desirable neighborhood, so there's more risk and exposure for the buyer. And in relation to that risk and exposure, the buyer is going to want to pay less for the property and pay a higher cap rate. On the flip side, if you have a really nice property in a great location and you've done a great job with, maybe your property manager has kept pace with market rents and you're in a great neighborhood, your rents are up to market, you've done a good job maintaining it, and your property looks spiffy, then you're going to be able to drive your cap rate down and your price up. So again, cap rate and price are inverse to each other. The higher the cap rate, that to me is typically a little bit of a red flag, that especially if it's in the 6 to 8% cap rate range, then there's probably some risk that's associated with that property. Now, be careful when you're pricing your property to make sure that you have a realistic cap rate. I recently saw a property that hit the market and the broker had priced that at a 4.25% cap rate. Now, market is more in the 5% range. So why did he price the property below the market cap rate? Because he was trying to get top dollar for his seller, which I understand that situation, but it has to be supportable and you have to be able to basically document how you came up with that number. Now, from the broker's perspective, his whole leg to stand on in his marketing package was, hey, we're below market rent. So our rents are $1,000, but market rent is at $1,500. But here's the catch. We're in the state of Oregon, so we have rent control of 9.2% currently. And there's no way that you could just take over that property as a buyer and automatically raise rents to $1,500 upon the lease renewal. You can only raise rents an additional 9.2%. So it would effectively take a buyer 4 to 5 years before they would effectively be able to raise rents enough to actually catch up to what the broker was saying was market rents. So don't make that mistake when you're pricing your property and trying to determine the most probable sales price. Be aware of that if a broker tells you, oh, well, your rents are low, but this is market, so this is how I'm going to advertise that property, be cautious, because the broker may not know what they're doing, and that may come back for a day of reckoning when you get under contract, especially if the buyer is going to use financing and an appraiser or a lender is involved. The other things from a buyer's standpoint, again, we talked about cash flow, we talked about cap rate, and now we want to talk about curb appeal. How clean does your property look? Because the thing that a buyer is looking at is this a good looking property where a buyer would want to buy it, but more importantly, a tenant would want to live there? Everything derives around the tenant at that point, because they want to make sure that they're attracting top quality tenants and that the property is appealing. So curb appeal is super important. Spend a couple of weekends. If you're going to be a weekend warrior, spend a couple of weekends, get your property spruced up, hire a handyman, have them do some exterior painting, some curb cleanup, some landscaping, whatever it takes to make your property pop and look good, I would recommend that you do that before you bring your property to the market. You can never get a second chance to recreate your market appeal. You get pretty much one chance when you first take it to market. So little things like making sure that your dumpster is not overflowing with trash. Even if you have to hire a handyman to haul away mattresses, old TVs, whatever's around the dumpster. A lot of times tenants don't know what to do with stuff, or neighboring tenants will drag stuff over to your dumpster. Couches, I've seen couches, refrigerators, mattresses, all that is an eyesore for your property. Hire a handyman and have them carry all that stuff off and take it to the dump or the recycle place so that your property looks clean and appealing to a buyer as well as a tenant. Because remember, when a buyer starts to look at your property through their eyes for buying, they're also looking at it through the eyes of a tenant. Would I want to live in this property? Because they're trying to figure out, are they going to be able to attract those top tenants that they need that are going to be able to pay the rent? So the selling points from your standpoint is every property is its own unique asset. Every property has its own unique features. Maybe you've renovated your units. Maybe you've got laminate flooring down compared to carpet. Maybe you've raised rents in the last 60 to 90 days. Or maybe you're a value add opportunity and you've just done well managing this property yourself, but there's some opportunity for a buyer to come in and add some improvements to the property. That's a pretty good selling point, and not all properties are value add opportunities. So when I'm trying to help a seller decide how to get top dollar, we're looking for some of the unique selling points of your property that I can point out to a buyer. And then lastly, finding a buyer. I started 180 days ago looking for your buyer. So I subscribe to some marketing systems that allows me to reach out to buyers and sellers in the local market. And I'm continually working on developing relationships with buyers up front. Why do I do that? Because a lot of buyers need education and knowledge going into the process. A lot of times they need to get pre-qualified with a lender. They need to get their cash pulled together. They may need to sell a property as their down leg if they're going to do a 1031 tax deferred exchange. And I find that just takes time to educate that buyer and get them in a ready, set position. So just rest assured, I started about 6 months ago working with the buyer pool that's most likely going to be a good candidate to buy your property. So if you want more information on how to sell your apartment for top dollar fast, click on the link down below to download my free How to Sell Your Apartment for Top Dollar Fast PDF, and it answers all of the questions that you may have on how to get top dollar. I'm Rene Nelson with Pacwest Commercial Real Estate. Have a fantastic day.